On. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation organized by the Norwegian chapter of the Internet Society. I'm the former chairperson of ISOC Norway. We have several ISOC people here, but today's conversation isn't a typical Internet Society topic. It's more around legislations, which we do care a lot about, but also open source. And today we have a nice panel here, myself included, of course. I consider myself nice too. You are. Let's start with a quick introduction about of who we are, and then we'll go into what the topic of today's conversation is. So if we start at the end here with Kaspar.
Yeah, I am Kaspar Rosager Ludvigsen. I am a Danish lawyer. I'm doing a Ph.D. in cybersecurity and law, and I also already have had a postdoc for another year, but we're nearing a year at the University of Newcastle. And I, as I said, do research in cybersecurity and law. In the context of this panel, I am here to represent the law and the security side, coincidentally. And I also really love EU law, so it's great to have me here when we're literally talking about that quite a lot today.
Yep. And you've been a practitioner of EU law.
That is true, that is true. I also used to be a civil servant in something called Ankestyrelsen in Denmark, which is where all appeal decisions, or most administrative law appeal decisions go to. So I pretended to be an administrative judge for a while there, which was fun too.
Hi, I'm Simon Phipps. I am a stateless European, currently clinging to the United Kingdom, but with my citizenship removed by my government. So I have been working in the field of open source for a long time, for lots of big international companies. I stopped being a slave of international corporations in 2010 and became the president of the Open Source Initiative. I've been working at Open Source Initiative as a volunteer for a decade, and then 2 years ago became a paid member of staff. And my focus area at the Open Source Initiative is European policy and how it affects open source. And at the moment I'm focused particularly on a tidal wave of legislation that's coming out of Brussels in connection with the digital agenda, all written by people who love open source, but unfortunately don't understand it well enough to not accidentally kill it as they love it. Good.
Thank you.
Hello everyone. My name is Fjeld. I work as a senior security analyst at a company called Defendable. I'm responsible for advising the head of security in corporations, and I'm the go-to guy if everything fails and there's an emergency. Then I get called out, and I'm in the front line of that. So I'm the info security motive in this alibi.
And
alibi
only here until your pager goes off.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry about that. I also have a record of initiatives with free and open software. I was the head of the Norwegian Unix user group for many years, and I'm still engaged with that. So that's not a field that's unfamiliar to me.
And quickly about myself, I'll take off my Internet Society hat and put on my open source hat. I've been part of meetup community in Oslo and Norway around the Perl and CPAN open source ecosystems. Organized meetups and hackathons and conferences, and I'm also here as a person who channels the thoughts and will of the Perl toolchain community, which is a group of people who work on the common infrastructure for one of those larger open source communities out there, and who very much care about supply chain security, how the software people are using is actually distributed, and issues around authenticity and who gets to publish things, and all those juicy topics that are relevant for this community here. And I might also mention just quickly that both Hans Petter and myself, we've been involved in a hackerspace here in Oslo called Hackeriet, which is a gathering of software interested and security interested people who want to have a place where we can hang out and do projects and talk about anything related to computers and policy and geeking out on stuff. So this tonight's topic has actually been a recurring topic at that place also. So that's one of the reasons we have perhaps a few of these guys here in the audience. And thank you for showing. So EU is doing stuff. We're not in the EU right now. We are in the European Economic Area. So we're standing in Norway outside and looking what our neighbors are doing and saying, oh shit, what's going to happen? So in a sense, it's kind of weird to talk about EU laws outside of the EU, but in a sense, these laws will be affecting lots of people outside of the EU in general, and anybody who wants to do business with the EU, even if it's far away on the other side of the planet, they will have to kind of care a little bit about this. So just to build up some context, I would like you to, maybe Kaspar, if you will, quickly give us a short introduction on which laws that are going to have the most impact when it comes to open source and security.
Yeah, because this relates to the security part, the European Union has, after, let's say, because you can take this in two ways. You can say, are we starting from when the EU made new types of product legislation? Because even back then, I would argue the security became an angle that they focused more on. Or we can do a post-GDPR world, which is probably also very adequate here, as most people have a relationship, familiarity, and maybe hatred towards GDPR, all of which are fair. It was not the perfect regulation in any way. None of us that read it very early on and followed all the way and saw its implementation, and years after keep seeing its implementation, think so. But the security. So what we're going to talk about today amounts to, let's focus primarily on 4 pieces of legislation. So we have the Cyber Resilience Act, which is kind of the primary piece of legislation which we'll discuss today. And then we have the NIS2 directive, which is the follow-up to the first NIS directive, which is essentially the infrastructure security directive. And it's mostly cybersecurity, but in its wording does actually expand a bit into physical cybersecurity, making sure that you can't actually access stuff. Let me make a quick anecdote for infrastructure there. The NIS directive, the first one was implemented in different ways in each country, but the example I bring up to computer scientists when explaining this is electricians. How did we do that in Denmark? How did we make cybersecurity better for electricians? And that sounds really weird, but they maintain infrastructure, and they maintain critical infrastructure. So there's a whole set of administrative rules just about what kind of security should they have, and what are the incident response types they need to do, both in physical and normal cybersecurity. But that would be NIS2, sort of the second directive there. We also want to talk a bit about the Digital Markets Act, because that, these big platforms may or may not rely on free open source software, but as we will get to later, it maybe is a bit more complicated than that, but that's also an act that everyone will feel something from, because we use Twitter or Facebook or something like that, and all these companies will be affected by the Digital Markets Act. And then maybe we'll talk about some other cyber initiatives, but let's maybe take those 3 primarily first, and perhaps also the product liability directive, the new one that's coming up. The problem with discussing that becomes we don't know how it's going to end up, but
yes. And they're not returning my emails about it.
No.
So there's a couple. There's more.
Yeah, way more.
Just to let you know, I work for OSI a third of my time, and there is the CRA, there's NIS2, there's the Digital Markets Act. There's the Digital Services Act, which is applicable. There is the Product Liability Directive revision, which is in play, which makes all of the things in all of these bills give companies liability when they fail to do things about them. There is the upcoming Standard Essential Patent Directive regulation. There is the Interoperable Europe Act. There is a study on Europe's digital infrastructure, which is in progress. There's like 9 things that, it was Christmas, and we all got up and looked in our email, and there's about 9 things that are all coming the next day. So there's a whole lot of things in play at the moment, and they're not all completely terrible. The CRA does a thing that's really useful, which is create a statutory requirement to provide consumers with a secure computing environment. And that's a very useful and valid thing. The problem is that, as they say, when you open a door, anything can go through. And there are many doors open at the moment, and there are many better resourced companies than ISOC, OSI, and university researchers. And there's the potential that some very bad things will happen. And then, in addition, the people who've drafted the legislation haven't necessarily understood what they were writing about. And they have done one or two things that many of us in the open source community think are inadvisable. But the best way to sum up the CRA, I think, is to say that what it does, it extends the European CE mark to software. So once the CRA goes on the books, you'll begin to see software that's got a CE mark. If it has the CE mark, that means that the company that supplied the software to you claims that they comply with all of the relevant terms in the CRA.
Yeah, and
very quickly, the CE mark
Yeah.
is something you can look at electronic devices to say that they follow certain safety
Yeah.
demands.
Well, it's the harmonized way for Europe to allow manufacturers to indicate they're complying with EU law.
Right.
So you see it on everything. You see it on children's toys, you see it on cars, you see it on refrigerators, and now you're going to start seeing it on software as well.
And this is where the part I mentioned, the new products initiatives, comes in, because that was when the modern version of the CE mark appeared and started to be used on all the new types, all the types of products they make new legislation for. So that's the connection I really wanted to make there. But you're right, that's the massive part, that you have this process which was otherwise that whole products initiative is interesting because they think themselves at least, they standardize the way you control, for example, the CE mark. When should we do sweeps, when shouldn't we do sweeps? A lot of legislation mimics this structure, and that's why knowing past product legislation tells you a lot about the Cyber Resilience Act, which is dumb because they were co-regulations, a lot of them. Why did they start using acts? There's no answer. Like the act regulation is one-to-one the same in the EU right now. It's just a wording. So you should call it the act, Cyber Resilience Act, but in reality it is just a regulation. It's just because it sounds fancier, perhaps.
Well, I mean, that needs clarifying for people as well who don't play games here. So the European Union does two things to all the member states. One of the things it does is it issues directives. A directive tells every country in the European Union, you've got to now make some laws that do the thing that's in this directive. And so the directive gets transposed into national law over a period of 2 or maybe even 3 years from the date that the European Parliament approves it. And then there are regulations or acts, and those are union-wide laws that become applicable immediately when the European Parliament passes them. So the Cyber Resilience Act is going to be passed in the 3rd quarter this year, and it will immediately become effective, and its rules will then affect software manufacturers within 1 to 2 years from the date that it becomes effective. Got loads of questions there, Salve. Are you ignoring?
Salve?
Yeah.
Just for the order, do you want to have questions while you're talking, or do you want to have some sort of a batch?
Let's do quickly just to establish some basic information here on what this is and who it applies to, which was my next question. And then we can have a few questions now and then. Because we on the panel here also have some questions. So take it easy. We have almost 2 hours in total for this whole thing here, so no stress.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, could you repeat that timeline?
So the Cyber Resilience Act is being pressed very fast. It's using a new structure for European legislation. Previously, all European legislation used terminology from something called the Blue Guide, and there was a lot of thinking you had to do in writing new legislation because you had to work out how your new terminology complemented what was in the Blue Guide. But there's now a new harmonized framework for legislation that has been devised, and this is one of the first acts that uses that harmonized framework, and consequently the timeline from the European Commission issuing draft text, which happened at the beginning of this year, to it becoming a law, which is going to happen maybe by September this year.
Wow.
Is a hugely accelerated timeline to what we're used to, where we're used to the European Commission writing text and it taking maybe 2 years to reach the stage where the Parliament is ready to vote on it. because everybody has decided to restrict themselves to only using the terminology in the new framework. And because of that, because it's using the new legislative framework, it's greatly accelerated. And then in addition to that, the Swedish presidency is very keen to get this onto the books before they hand the keys of the kingdom over to the next rulers of the European Council. And so that is also a reason why it's on an accelerated timeline. And then when you look at the CRA, its provisions say that it becomes effective. I think it's there's some things that are 1 year after ratification, and there's some things that are 2 years after.
Yeah, this is very standard procedure for product legislation, that they will often, especially in the end, have provisions that say, oh, this part goes into effect here and this goes into effect here. This is standard. For the Cyber Resilience Act, we should maybe have seen a longer transitionary period, honestly, because some of the things you're doing are, massive, even though, we'll talk about that in a moment, even though the way the preambles, so in EU law, you have preambles, you have articles, you have annexes. Those are the three parts you have in directives or in regulations or acts. And then you might also want to include parliamentary debates or council debates for impact studies and all the other sources to understand what are you even reading here. But the main text should be the articles, then the preambles, those and then annexes, but depending on the text. But you really want to focus on that. So we'll talk a little bit about those because they start showing, they will answer some of your questions. And then they won't at the same time. But what I wanted to mention was it's not unusual now for the EU, or rather they're able to, postponement is possible, is what I wanted to point out here. So I work with medical devices, that's one of my specialization areas, also regarding security, because in that situation, security is safety, because if medical device fails, you could get injured. You can't get injured necessarily with other things fail because of adversarial attacks from adversaries, from whoever. But the medical device regulation was supposed to have entered into force, the new one, in 2020. We had COVID, so we still, some things now are exempted that haven't been done yet. So we're 3 years past when it was supposed to enter into force. So what I'm trying to say is that there are possibilities, even if it seems rigid, I'm pretty sure we might see ways in which some of these parts could be delayed if necessary. And that would be something we perhaps here in the panel, for some of the things we'll talk about, we've already said now, but even later, we might be interested in a postponement to protect some aspects there.
I'm less optimistic than that. I believe that this act is being viewed by parliamentarians as a protecting the children class act.
Oh.
And consequently, it is going to be passed with the greatest speed.
So let's just assume we have to hurry.
Yeah, so I do think we have to hurry with that. If we want to make changes, the amendment deadline is April 27th in
next
Parliament,
week.
which is next week. The debates will be in May, and we do have some elasticity in helping parliamentarians understand the consequences of what's going on, but we don't think we can change any of the structure anymore. We think that the structure of the CRA is pretty much fixed now.
Okay. Do you have something important? Because I would like to move on.
Quite.
Yeah.
He mentions protecting the children. There is actually a separate act that's worth reading if you want to.
Yeah, that's another one.
Child sexual abuse, I think, act as well.
Yes,
That's a little bit beyond the topic of this panel.
chat control.
Yeah, chat control. That is a kind of worms which is worth its own meeting.
But we've been advised by parliamentarians that most MEPs consider this to be a primary consumer protection act, right, and they do not believe it should be delayed for any reason. Yeah.
Could you guys very quickly give us a rough picture of who these laws apply to?
Okay, so originally, we understand that originally the CRA was intended to apply only to the manufacturers of devices that had software in them. So things like modems, medical appliances, telephones, all the mobile phone people managed to get themselves exempted from it. So their mobile devices are largely exempt. And then there was an impact assessment conducted, and the impact assessment said that there was no impact from extending the Act to cover all software, not just software that's embedded in devices. And they based that on reading a German academic's study that said that described software as made a distinction about open source software between commercial and community open source, and they misunderstood the academic and used his research as the basis for a decision to apply it to everything. So this act applies to all software, so that it describes applicability is to products with digital elements. And those products with digital elements
There.
no longer need to have a physical component.
That's
So any product,
Casper wants to
any product with a digital element without a physical component is included, as well as products with a digital element that include a physical component.
And it needs to have logical or physical network access. That's the other part.
That's the other.
You can, and also, you mentioned medical devices. No, medical devices are exempted because you have the
right.
medical device legislation. Cars are exempted because the certification process is a bit different because it includes safety aspects.
Yeah.
And you have more exemptions than that. But basically, the coverage there, is quite wide. I may have actually contributed to them wanting non-embedded and embedded software and hardware because we argued from a safety and security perspective that it's necessary to include them. We didn't say that it's easy. No, we said it was necessary for.
But this
other
is
reasons.
this is for the CRA mostly.
Yes.
And then we have the NIS2 directive, which
Yes.
kind of tries to achieve the same thing, but for critical infrastructure.
Yeah, so NIS2 directive is a directive, which means implementation. But the interesting part is that very much like the GDPR, except we didn't go to regulation, we have a past experience. NIS1 existed. It failed, some argue, but we have experience on a national basis of the implementation, what we should do, and NIS increases the requirements and includes open source. So surprisingly, this is why Control F when you read a PDF is the best friend ever. Like, I read the whole thing, of course, but if I need to remind myself, oh yeah, open source is mentioned in an article, because every member state, by 2025, which is when most of these things must be implemented, ideally, but this is the EU. We're used to a lot of countries being like, oh, I can't implement it very well, oh, I'll take a couple years extra, and then they get fined at the European Court, and the Commission is mad at them, but, so 25, but ideally, well, probably later. That's how we usually know it. But it basically forces member states to make good legislation about when shouldn't you use open source software or free open source software in your critical infrastructure. And it does not really, it maybe expands what is a critical infrastructure and what is a critical entity a little bit, but it's very, very, as in most of the academic writings or even thoughts about NIS1 will apply to NIS2 as well, and still in the annex part.
I've read that there's a whole lot of new sectors that are touched by NIS2.
Basically, so this is again the EU. Countries like Denmark already included these in critical infrastructure.
Oh, okay.
So the Commission, like they usually do, not just Denmark, also the Netherlands, but they go, oh, a country has a good way to do this, let's use this in an updated legislation.
Right. So it's different from country to country. But okay, do you have a question?
The CRA, it has an exemption for free and open software that is not commercially driven.
So this is actually a question where we don't even have academic papers that can answer this fully yet. Basically, it comes down to how you read the definition of products. It comes down to how you read the definition of manufacturers, and this comes back to what Simon already mentioned. But depending on how it's understood in actual enforcement, so we can sit here and talk about how this is the typical risk versus what happens in practice afterwards. Like there might be a lot of risk. There might be EU could ruin things. It also might not. It's difficult because we're working with people and giant infrastructures with lots of people, speaking of law, that wants to do law on top of also doing technical stuff at the same time. So the answer to that would be it relies on the commercial part, and the commercial part is just complicated with free open source software because often you will have projects that to people that aren't part of the project, don't use it, don't understand it, look commercial but free and open source, of course. Yeah. But to those that work on it volunteer basis, perhaps, or passion, won't be commercial to them.
And they define that if you do training or support, that's commercial, so then it's not.
Yeah,
accepted.
you're providing it, yes.
So that this whole topic is one of the great areas of complexity because. This text was drafted after the impact assessment said to expand to all products with digital elements, and the impact assessment made the incorrect assessment of Dirk Riel's research, and incorrectly decided that you could differentiate between community open source and commercial open source, not realizing that all open source software is commercial in the sense that it can be used in commerce. Which is what matters. And while the Blue Guide gives some useful language that might provide guidance, many communities have read this text in Recital 10, and they say, well, hold on a minute, Eclipse Foundation, well, we have a regular release cycle, and that means we qualify because we are regularly releasing software. And then NLNet Labs, who produce all the infrastructure for the internet, along with a US counterpart. They read it and they said, well, hold on a minute. Many companies fund NLNet labs with donations on the basis that they're then going to receive all the software that runs DNS. And surely we count as commercial as well. And so as many groups have looked at it, they've felt that the language in Recital 10 is insufficiently articulated to actually help organizations know with certainty that they don't count as being commercial. And consequently, there are endless amendments around. I've got one of them here. There's endless attempts to modify Recital 10 so that it is clear about stating that the commercial intent doesn't matter. But the whole error of Recital 10 is believing that you can distinguish on the basis of intent with the software anyway, because the whole point of open source software is there is no connection between the motives of the person writing the software and the motives of the person deploying the software. And consequently, there's no such thing as commercial software. And at the same time, all software is commercial. And so once I explained this to Benjamin, who wrote this CRA, and he was a little bit flummoxed by it. He hadn't really expected that to be the case.
Very quickly, if you can keep it short.
So yeah, so the enforcement structure, I don't disagree with Recital 10 being kind of crap, but that's typical with recitals or preambles. Both words are correct here. They won't, like the people that actually enforce won't read the recitals necessarily. They will read primarily the articles, and in the articles you can definitely interpret ways out of this. But my issue then becomes, will the market surveillance bodies, aka the authorities actually enforcing, will they, or what will they do in the first place regarding open source software? That I could also, I kind of, like, you know, I'm kind of confused about essentially.
Well, and then there's problems further down the text as well, like in Article 16.
I want to see if I can understand some of the picture here and summarize it. EU wants increased security and awareness and processes throughout the societies in Europe. So they find different parts of businesses and sectors where they can make a big difference by asking people to, or businesses to, follow a bunch of new laws. It applies to software that they have, and then I'm thinking, all right, most of the software out there today runs on open source, and I've seen numbers ranging from 60 to 98%. Like if some business has a service they're making for their local waterworks, or they write some software for deploying updates to switches or routers, they use open source software as part of the stack, almost guaranteed. And that means if they have to have a security regime in place, they will have to include that open source software into the security regime. Like figuring out what you are running, making sure it's easy and up to date, and if an incident happens or some 0-day suddenly appears out of Norway, Norway?
Out of Norway?
Nowhere. We don't. Norway isn't bigger than 0 days. As far as
I thought it was all coming from Russia as well.
No comment. Then you have to be able to respond accordingly.
Yeah.
But for me, the voices of the people that actually write the software, the developers who wrote something useful for themselves in their free time, just for fun even, or just to try out some new language or experiment a little bit with the technology, and someone else picked it up and said, yes, this is useful, and it has an open source license on it, so I will be using it. And suddenly it becomes part of critical infrastructure. And it doesn't have to have happened just recently. It might have happened 10 or 15 years ago. Someone wrote something useful for fun, and it turned out to be so useful that it is part of something that updates a website that is being used by public administration for something important, for example.
Indeed.
And then there's a question like, okay, what happens here? Like, if the spectrum from people who and business and organizations who keep track of and make sure those critical infrastructures on those devices work as expected, all the way to the volunteers that they base upon. There's like a point at which liability stops, and that's the current discussion. Like, should open source businesses be liable? Should the developers be liable? Should only regular businesses that don't have? That's one part, but even then, those people, where the line is drawn,
Right.
those people inside of the line of liability, they will look around towards those who are not liable, but we still need these guys, and they need to be responsive and help us make sure that they're part of whatever regime those who are liable have to follow. So even if we find a sensible place where liability stops, the rest will be affected.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good thing, because I think that finally companies who have been strip mining open source for years and contributing nothing to the developers and the communities working with the software are suddenly going to be faced with a huge liability, because the PLD is going to create this massive liability for manufacturers of products with digital elements. And they're going to have to come to all of these communities and say, please will you help us to comply with the Cyber Resilience Act, because we don't want to become liable for 10% of our annual global turnover.
But then you have some guy sitting in mom's basement somewhere in California saying, what?
Yeah, well...
Me? Hey, I don't live in the EU.
Yeah.
Why should I care?
Yes, well, and he's the one who's going to have to be given the money to care. And I quite like that. I quite like the idea that, naming no corporations in particular, some corporations are going to have to go to that guy in a Nebraska basement and hire him.
Yeah.
It's very quickly.
So this is where I also write and focus on supply chain security, because this is where the CRA is interesting too. I was supposed to have worked with Google and GitHub this year on this specific matter, but because I'm changing jobs, I have to make a new grant proposal for that exact project. But basically, they're very interested in automating these issues before the CRA even comes into effect, or at least help corporations automate it and figure out what parts are vulnerable and which parts we then, for example, have to fulfill requirements for in a Cyber Resilience Act way. But no, like I agree with Simon that it's nice to see this, but I also, Salve, you and I talked about this before, but there's obviously a risk of not just harassment, but when you're so in the CRA, this is about components. Because the CRA is about the manufacturer. This is product legislation, as I said in the start. So manufacturer, importer, distributor, and all the other words they use. But manufacturer is the core one here. The obligation for manufacturers, this is Article 10 usually. It is also on this one. That one focuses on the component part, and on the responsibility for maintaining and understanding the components is on the manufacturer. This mirrors what we saw when the medical device regulation came into effect, where in that community, you take it up very, 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 very seriously, but coincidentally, you still use for free and open source solutions sometimes, but then we expect the notified bodies to provide the correct testing to make sure that maybe they make their own version for that specific product that then lasts for 5 years before they make the updated version or whatever happens. Unlike the CRA, which focuses on 5-year life cycle minimally-ish, the medical device industry does less. It's 2 or 3 years, but we wish it was 5 years. It would be nice. Yeah. But yeah, that's basically.
To round this up, there's going to be a very good effect from the CRA, which is that corporations will have to begin to take responsibility for the security of the software that they have basically been. The word steal isn't the right word to use because it's been offered willingly, but they've been taking software from people, placing an expectation on them, and then being offended when they don't meet it. And this is going to put teeth behind the requirement that they go down the supply chain and that they actually have a professional relationship with people in their supply chain. At the same time, the problem is that it isn't clear where the dividing line for who is actually responsible is. Yeah. And if we don't get that clarified, we may well discover that manufacturers of the guy in the basement in Nebraska may decide to put a geo-block on his Git repository to make sure that people in Europe can't get his code, so he doesn't accidentally become liable.
So that means we'll still have to find ways to keep a certain level of goodwill alive, and not make this into a war between people who make the code and those who use it. And say, I sometimes use the term freeloader when talking about companies who just use open source and never do any interaction with the community or give anything back or sponsor anything. That sounds like some changes are up front. But before we go there, I want to hear from you, Hans Petter. Because while it's not sure exactly what these laws specifically creates of checklists to go through, because there's some standards out there, and some of them are work in progress, some of them are best practices, some of them might, as I understand, might be managed by standarding bodies, maybe. We'll see how that turns out. But we know something already today of how to practice good security. Yeah, and what we can expect that businesses and the open source communities they depend upon might get, what type of questions, what type of infrastructure do you think would be coming here? If a business says, for example, I need to have know what's going on when it comes to security updates.
Yeah.
Could you go a little bit into that?
The last couple of years, there's been a big history of components having security issues, like Log4j, like Heartbeat, and it didn't really matter if you had a good even knowledge base of what software you had installed. You had to know how was this software built, what are those components, and it's hard enough today for corporations to know all the software that is installed and chase down and keep that updated. And then knowing what components is used, what software use the components Log4j is hard. This bill calls for a bill of materials, if I understand correctly.
There's no actual nice legal requirement.
No,
we asked, well, some of us
That's
asked
what
for
we're going to need at least.
No, because that's illusionary. I would argue it's an illusion. It does not work that well yet unless you do it through procurement. In the US, for example, they do it voluntarily in private contracts. Yeah, you can still lie in them, and yeah, you'll be liable, but you have to do the lawsuit afterwards, and then who cares? So in procurement, when you do a procurement contract and you have to build this thing, then you can somewhat enforce a bill of materials. Bill of materials, just for information, is detailing the cybersecurity details and ways it's implemented, a lot of other things, and it's reminiscent of, like, it's supposed to be referring to bill of lading from shipping from international private.
I'm not that interested in the liability part of it, because I'm more interested in the fact of actually being able to fix it. And you need to know the components to be able to fix it. So a bill of materials would be nice to have, at least, if it's not a requirement.
I can say very quickly about bill of materials. There is an aspect that there are already lots of tooling out there that tries to analyze the software stack you're using. But it's an insanely complicated landscape to navigate. And it also depends very much on each ecosystem that they depend on. So, for example, me as a Perl person and caring about CPAN, I know that we have the metadata available within our ecosystem, maybe missing a few bits and pieces here and there, but we have the people and the knowledge to add that, what is missing, and produce some output which can be made part into a tooling that helps create a picture like this. And I imagine that any open source community that is somewhat organized can help make this happen in some way. So for me, it's not all just, it doesn't have to be a question about liability. Well, there is someone who might be liable, but open source has thrived because of cooperation and sharing and people trying to solve the problems that they need to have solved right with the code in front of them. And that's perhaps enough, I don't know.
The legislation also has a lot of calls for industry best standard, best practices and stuff like that, and so that's going to be defined in some sub pages that are more easily updated. I know, but we can already know that something like an SQL injection is if you have that vulnerability, that's not a state-of-the-art attacks type. We've been doing that since the 90s, and the security field has already cataloged the different ways we are getting attacked. We know very well how we're getting attacked, and we know that a lot of that is not state-of-the-art. Yeah.
And it comes from the name here, Resilience. It's not called the Cyber Security Act, because that's a different act, and that's about ENISA. In the EU, it's about authorities. It doesn't have anything to do with products. But it's about resilience. It's about recovering as well. It's about all the other processes. Security isn't just about can we prevent the failure or about the type of attack. It's also about fault recovery, which really
That's a very good point.
which the legislation does make a much better attempt of, I would argue, because the risk and management cycle it describes, also in the annex, is what I wish the medical device regulation had. It's more detailed and nice to see. But you're right, as in the standards and the best practice stuff is the usual suspects, sadly, because the EU was supposed to, many years ago, in many fields, create their own free standards. Did it happen? No. Do we know why? No.
Well, actually, we've got a reasonably good idea why.
But these acts will not make the sysadmins of corporations be required to keep their software updated.
So there won't be any. There's no specifics in here.
No.
So actually, it's interesting looking at the parliamentary committee, the IMCO committee, has got its proposed changes, and they've inserted lots of references to NIS2 and to ENISA in the CRA to anchor some of the requirements, some of the protections to those organisations. But basically, the CRA says, actually, we're not going to tell you how to do it. We're just going to tell you that we're going to whip you if you don't do it.
Are we still going to see ATMs with Windows XP on?
I think that, that it would be a shame to see them go. Because who's going to create the museum for them if they aren't on public display? The CRA doesn't go in there and directly tell you what to do. But what it does do is really for the first time for general software products, it goes and gives you a duty, it places the requirement on you, and then other acts are going to provide the stick to beat you and tell you what the mechanisms that you must follow are. And so the CRA isn't about those things.
One specific question. Do these laws in any way from now on, or when they get activated, require businesses to keep their software up to date?
So that depends on how you interpret it. So I, as not so positivistic, but more realism, is a philosophical direction in law, which is very good with cybersecurity, because it's about what can actually be done and how do we do it, instead of how do we read it beautifully, which is how law often is, sadly. You could definitely read out of it means to for authorities to enforce it in a way where they would argue the up-to-date part. Thing is, with lifecycle in the CRA does require updates. So there will be you have to service it so it functions as it's supposed to, and you can't misuse it within some parameters, because liability, you can't be liable for someone misusing your product. It even states that both early and later. Luckily, we won't have a situation here where it's easy to misuse and not be liable. If you misuse or use it against the intended purpose, the manufacturer won't be liable. You will be for the damage you cause. But no, as in, not again, it's not technology specifically saying, you must keep it up to date. It's not saying that. No. Because the EU loves technology neutral legislation, which is really annoying sometimes.
There are lots of implications though, right?
Well, I'd frame it differently to this. What I would say is there's no express requirement you have to keep your software up to date. However, once you are aware of exploitable vulnerabilities in your software, you have a duty to resolve them.
Yeah. And that basically means you have to keep it up to date.
And that basically does mean you have to keep it up to date. In the open source community, we're concerned about the way that's been framed, because the writer of the legislation has used a lot of proprietary software concepts to explain what they want to do, and consequently they say things like, you must not release a product with any known vulnerabilities.
Right.
Well, that's fine if everything is done in secret, and then there's this day that the software goes out the door into the public. You can deal with that. But if you're an open source community, you can't possibly prevent people from seeing the software that's got known vulnerabilities in it, because, well, the source code is in the open and always has been.
And that does translate into the businesses who use that software and themselves are actually liable. That might be interesting.
Yeah.
Let's see, we've been chatting now for 45 minutes. Maybe we have room for 1 or 2 questions.
I have an idea. I know where they're coming from.
Yes, thank you. My name is Knut Irvin, in Norwegian Irvin. And yeah, it's great fun when people have jokes about Norwegian being nothing, because that's the truth. That's how we look at ourselves. And I will, because this is what not mentioned, other than indirectly, is the fact that open source licensing says no warranties, but it reflects back onto proprietary software business models, that they don't want to take any liability, any charge of anything whatsoever. And that's the business default regarding business-to-business software.
Yeah.
So people talk like free software is bad, and they portray free software as bad, but it's just reflecting business standard.
Yeah.
And also, when you pay a premium, you don't even pay for fixing the software that has these errors and things we absolutely want to get rid of, because that's one of the reasons that we make free software, is we can have the right to fix it, which the case is not in proprietary software. You are given a right not to fix it. And you are not warranted then as a producer of software with that kind of licensing to apply to the suggested EU regulation at all. So people, they are inventing free software as bad, when the truth are that free software actually give you a right to repair. Also, it kind of entangled a consumer right view, and this is my background in also working in Nokia, so I have some corporate insight. And it's bigger than most, because they were selling hundreds of millions of phones when I were working there. As these questions were raised, or hands were risen, onto this, whom are we giving warranties? Because if we give a warranty and we don't, you know, it's 100 million people, how are you going to pay for that?
Yes.
And you know, there you have it. So I want you to elaborate on those things, how these things put together. Thank you.
Do you want to take several questions, or do you want to?
No, if there's one more,
Okay,
Steinar has
because you've got about 3 people who've been consistently
Yeah.
begging to ask a question. So.
Yeah, and I just have to say this event is being recorded and streamed, so please state your name and be aware
Yes.
that it's been recorded and streamed.
And it would be good if you could frame your comments as, at least attempt to frame them in the form of a question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll do my best. My name is Maddie Neustadt. I'm new to Oslo. I'm an American licensed technology attorney working for a company here in Norway.
Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, similarly to some of the questions on warranty and development and ownership, a lot of software these days is being put on a cloud platform. And I know that the Cyber Resiliency Act specifically kind of carves out cloud and pushes it to ANISA, but ANISA only covers infrastructure as critical infrastructure for cloud computing and not necessarily the application and data layers. So I'm curious where you see the warranties flowing under the new laws and regimes and liabilities when it comes to application and data layer cloud offerings.
So I'll let you comment on warranty.
Yeah.
Oh, there's another question over there.
one quick more question, and then we'll answer.
3 at a time.
Thanks. Torgeir Waterhouse. I have a question surrounding or regarding country of origin, because that is also one of the things coming more and more into focus in all the different types of regulations and directives, and also the debate surrounding the legislations. And if I recall correctly, there was a verdict in the US about 10 years ago where they sort of concluded that the country of compiling is to be concluded as the country of origin. But any thoughts on how that will pan out given the new regulations that are upcoming?
So I think that one's really easy, honestly, because this regulation doesn't care about the software; it cares about the manufacturer, and consequently, it's clear that if a manufacturer offers you software, places software on the market in the European Union, then they're responsible, and there is no question of where they are located or of the origin of the software. And I think that solves all of these questions about country of origin by
CRA exclusively, yes.
yes, for the CRA.
Bundle of things.
I'm definitely going to let Kaspar talk about warranty, but the one thing that's happened in the open source community is everyone has said, hey, haven't you seen in the BSD there's a disclaimer of warranty? And open source developers kind of assume that by putting things in all caps at the end of the license, they can override national law. And we've had to explain to people that they can only disclaim warranty to the extent that the law allows them to disclaim warranty, and that the CRA prohibits them from disclaiming warranty because you can't disclaim any of those liabilities. And consequently, all of the, I wouldn't talk in terms of a warranty, but I would point out that you can't disclaim your responsibilities under the CRA. If you qualify as a manufacturer placing product on the market in the European Union, then you have responsibilities under the CRA that will be turned into liabilities under the Product Liability Directive. And there is absolutely no way and no point size of capitals that you can use that will solve that problem for you. But Kaspar.
Yeah, so I'll do all three separately because there are some specific comments for each. About the compiling part, so an interesting thing with EU law is that this discussion of service versus product is old and matters to the open source community as well. But in terms of compiling, a lot has happened since then, but it would again be about distribution. So even if you compile it the US but then send it to the EU, then the one that sells it in the EU will be liable because that's a distributor liability, which is separate from manufacturer liability, and the CRA also focuses on this because a lot of companies think they can get around it, but the daughter companies or sister, whatever they make of structure, someone will still take the bill if something happens. Like you can't distribute products otherwise, or it'll be the middleman, the third party. In terms of warranty, what was the question again? I forgot. In terms of the warranty, So yeah, exactly. So this is very complicated again because we're working with 28 different jurisdictions. That's the first part. Second part is this is EU law. EU law is supranational. It's not national. It's supra, so it's above national law. And the obligations given there, especially in regulations, but some directives are really, really sharp and will give similar obligations in all countries. Some of them, not that many, but some. But no, you cannot get around responsibility just because you write it in your contract. For that reason, one, so supranationality, EU law doesn't care about you, it's going to force its way through. Two, you're doing, let's say it's at a consumer, or it's a consumer law applies, that depending on the country, but if you go by your rules, it'll be more lenient. And for that matter, normal obligations law or law of contracts or whatever you call it in each jurisdiction will also apply. So if you write something and you don't force them to read and understand it, it won't apply one-to-one in the way you thought it did. So writing a nice license for open source software and then making you scroll down isn't the same as the other party understanding it. And especially not if they're a consumer, then they won't understand it all. And as I said, EU law invalidates all of it anyway. But so there's basically a 3-step or 2-step process that you have to go through to check whether or not it even matters what you write when you make free and open source software. But and also to keep the warranty part, so warranty makes me more think about, making sure that if the product fails or something and then you want to deliver it back and so on. But yeah, in this context, if we think about the contractual parts, then yeah, no, you're not going to get anywhere with that, no matter what you do. The boilerplate clauses, aka standard contracts, and they won't meaningless.
Yes.
And then there was a question about cloud being
yes.
Yeah.
So on cloud, it's reasonable to assume that the CRA does. The CRA excludes software as a service from its scope. It's reasonable to assume that we will be seeing some fresh legislation fairly soon that will be doing both cloud and AI regulation. And I say that that's a reasonable assumption because I've seen it, so I know that it's coming. So it's definitely coming. But yes, it's temporarily, in the same way that medical appliances and mobile phones and automobiles are excluded from the CRA despite having digital elements. So software as a service is going to be covered under cloud regulations and under AI regulations.
Yeah. That was one I forgot to mention at the start. AI Act is also worth mentioning here for the free open source software because we have equivalents in AI, in the AI space too that are really important.
Right.
But to add to the cloud part, the answer until then becomes very complicated because it depends again then on jurisdiction. Because then it would be about obligations between different parties doing different things at the same time with privacy on top, security on top. Yeah, it gets really complicated. So we will look forward to.
Yeah, but I assume that's why it's been carved out, is because it would be very. The CRA is quite elegant in many ways because it uses the the placing on the market as the trigger for the legislation. It's quite clean in terms of its ability to deal with supranational issues and to deal with the origin of supply issues by saying, well, we don't really care about any of that. All we care is that it was placed on the market. Who placed it on the market for Europeans to use? And they're the people who've got the responsibility, and then we'll let them. It'll be the first time in history trickle down has worked. We'll see the responsibility trickle down the open source movement, hopefully accompanied by money.
Let's switch around a little bit now. Let's take the perspective of a business that is these laws apply to. They suddenly get a bunch of new laws that they have to understand, figure out how to respond to them, and what new demands they have to fulfill. Lots of businesses already are under some kind of regime. Like if you go to the fintech world, they know a lot about audits and traceability in code and all that stuff that's important. And so I'm imagining the amount of work they need to do is not as big as maybe other businesses that are suddenly being introduced to these laws for the first time. But now that they get these new laws, they will, let's assume for a moment they manage to get a full picture of all their dependencies through some magical means called the software bill of materials. And they figure out that they have a large amount, maybe certainly more than half of what they do has some open source dependencies that they need to keep track of. What should these businesses and institutions, how should they approach open source communities? Because right now they have a business going on, they have maybe even shareholders that they need to be accountable to, and now they have to talk with a completely heterogeneous global it's not even fair to call it a community. It's like literally tens of thousands of tiny communities.
Yeah, it's a community of communities of communities.
Yes, like there are at least 3 levels of communities and meta-communities.
Even CPAN.
Yeah, CPAN itself has like a few tens of thousands of modules. Each of those you could consider have a community. Maybe it's only a community of 1, but it's at least a few people who care about it.
So I think that's a fantastic question. I don't think that there's... for some communities, it's a lot clearer what will go on. So for the Java community, I think the Java community has got a much clearer structure. You know where stuff is coming from.
They're big also, and they have lots of resources.
And they've been used to creating sealed packages for distribution up until now. I think the communities that are going to have a really serious problem are the ones with dynamic loading repositories, like CPAN or like Node.
Yeah, PyPy, NPM.
Or PyPy. All of those communities, it isn't so much the fact that it's a dynamically loading environment, it's that dynamically loading environment has been used extensively to create a cascade of dependencies, where a node package can turn out to have dependencies that are like 5 layers down. Yeah. That you've absolutely no clue. Somebody decided they would use the sort function in that package over there that actually does color spectrum analysis. And you discover you're loading a color spectrum analysis package from that server over in that place over there. You've no real way of ever knowing it with Node. So I think that...
it's possible to figure out, but...
The chickens we thought were going to come home to roost with things like Node, I think are about to come home to roost, because people are going to have to identify those chickens and put leg rings on them.
But how should businesses approach this? Because they might look at this new landscape with lots of moving parts and individuals and small groups, each of them having different kinds of motivations, some of them just for fun, others because they work for an employer that needs something done. Others just are doing it as part because their professor asked to solve a problem at school or at uni. And still, it's in use. Like, should a business just say, I can't do this, I'm going to outsource it to large providers like Red Hat or...
Tidelift.
Tidelift.
Tidelift are on this already. They are ready to take your
That's
money.
About financing, though.
Yes. But they are right there, ready to take your money, to take this pain away from you. And I think we will for those places where there are dynamic loading environments and cascades of dependencies, I think we will quickly see intermediaries come in place who will give you a warranty.
Yeah, so that means if some student writes something interesting as part of their class curriculum or whatever they're being asked to do, publishes it, some business that decides to use it as part of some critical infrastructure, so there suddenly becomes a need to look at liability and all that stuff. And suddenly that student needs to think about, like, okay, well, how do I handle liability?
Well, I don't think they do, because they will not be the manufacturer putting the product on the market in Europe.
Right.
The person who will need to worry about the liability is Nokia. Need to worry about their liability, and Nokia will go find a service provider who will make sure that they do not have a liability problem. And it may be that service provider will provide them with a version of CPAN where
how about the student?
only a fifth of the products are there, because all the ones written by that student won't be that service provider won't let their filter pass through the things where their insurer won't let them take a risk on the ability to fix problems in a timely way.
So some insurers might come and say, no, this is a good open source software and that is not a good open source software.
I don't think they'll say that. I think what they'll do is they'll look at the processes of the intermediary that wants the insurance, and they will check whether those processes check whether it is written by a dog in a kennel or by a team of developers in Latvia, or whether it's written by.
But shouldn't this be more about what the software does instead of who writes it?
Well, I think that who is able to warrant that they're doing it in a safe way is almost as important as what it does. Although I'm amongst security professionals here, but I think that if you select your packages purely on the function, it's possible you may be exposing yourself to risk, because you never know which country is hosting the people writing that software and what it will do when you finally come to distribute your product.
Hans Petter first.
So this legislation is taking effect and being created when the budget for the year has already been decided, and
Yes.
there's no money for any of this anyway.
Yeah.
So the companies are going to go like, what happened? This was too fast. We are not going to acknowledge that this exists for at least a year.
Yeah.
And they will go and not understand.
Well, it's even better than that, because the Product Liability Directive isn't going to create the liability until it's transposed into national law, and it's not going to be transposed into national law
We have years.
for 2 to 3 years after being promulgated.
Yeah,
I have to disappoint you. The old product liability can still apply to this and will apply to it, yes. And it will do it in an individualized way, where, especially in Scandinavia, because we have, also in Germany, but we have a longer tradition than, for example, Bulgaria with product liability. We started doing it, around the start of the last millennium. So we've been on it for a while, and that, so it means someone is going to be responsible there.
In this time frame, there's a valid, a great opportunity for advisories and consultancies to make a lot of money on telling people what is a good idea. And it will take some time before they know what to do. But for the love of God, make stuff machine readable.
Yeah.
But if anything,
all those lessons you learned when GDPR was being done about going out and making money, giving expert consulting, same lessons apply here.
But to add, you mentioned critical infrastructure. If you imagine the business also had to do with that, that's where the NIS2 directive comes in. One, because each state will likely, hopefully, standardize the way they talk about how to use open source in critical infrastructure. We'll see if they do or not, but by the wording right now, it sounds a little bit more like it's up to each country. But let's imagine that. So then the business has to also follow that advice, which is usually just, as Simon actually mentioned, obviously good software is good software, but be very, very, very sure before you use this dependency. Like really, really sure if you can and have the resources for it. The other part is that the CRA is built up quite logically and rationally in terms of why you're doing this security and how. Like, as in, obviously, it's not technology specific enough to say do this and this and this, but it goes quite far. And if you read Annex 1, it has like an insanely good short description of how to have a good life cycle and what to focus on, like security-wise. So it's not bad.
So for me, if we take a step back to the business who looks at this new legislation and has to try to interact with the open source community, it's still that means you have a motivation and a checklist maybe from those laws, and then you find the right person in whatever communities you need to find it, and that might be in tens or hundreds of different places, and then have a conversation. And that's literally just the way to do it is the open source way, but where you have a motivated participant now with a new type of motivation that comes from legislation instead of from business needs.
It comes from fear instead of from good behavior.
But do they have? Can we expect businesses to say, we don't have any developers in-house, but we still need something solved. What should they do?
So let's just roll back a little to what the real question is. So the real question is, how do you comply with the CRA? And you comply with the CRA in a very similar way to the way that you might do other business quality compliance. What you do is you say, I've got processes set up that are going to deal with these things as they arise. So what that CE mark that you put on the software actually means is I certify that I have in place processes that will mean that none of the risks that the CRA deals with will harm my customers. Right. And that's what you're actually saying. So when it first comes into force, recognizing that the product liability hasn't actually caught up and recognizing that national enforcement bodies have actually not been resourced, you're probably fairly safe to say,
for a little while.
For a little while, I look at my existing processes, and they seem to meet all the things that are in Annex 1, and I'm just going to self-certify as CE compliant because I don't have a critical product. Now, it's different rules apply if you have a critical product, but if you don't have a critical product, you can just say, I think I do all that.
And how do you know if you have a critical product?
Well, that's carefully defined in the CRA.
Yes.
Could quickly do that. Give some examples.
Yeah. So critical infrastructure is obviously the things that make society run. So obviously, if you deliver software specifically for hospitals, and no, this won't make Windows critical infrastructure. But if you make custom for it, like if you make something custom for it in any way, so that can be surgical robots, pacemakers, because they're part of the greater infrastructure. That be it, electricity, water plants, everything that you logically would think of critical infrastructure usually is. Now, Facebook isn't, even though for some people it is critical in their lives. That being said,
social media is mentioned though.
Yeah, but not as an actual critical infrastructure.
Okay.
But it's about messaging services. It's about like conveyors there. Yes, but not literally.
So the challenge here is there's lots of things that we do care about. Probably people in ISOC Norway care about are critical infrastructure. So the DNS is definitely critical infrastructure.
Yes.
Domain name system is definitely.
Yes. Boundary routing is definitely critical infrastructure. Which is a shame because it's really not very good. So there are definitely things that are critical infrastructure, and critical infrastructure needs to either comply with national standards that relate to the area that is involved, or you need to get a third-party audit of the processes that you have in place to protect your customers. And that is the most worrying thing for open source communities. That's what's got Eclipse, for example, writing to the Commission saying, hey, you can't do this to us. That's what's got NL Labs and ISC and other organizations very concerned, is that although they will not have revenue streams that justify and fund those audits, nonetheless, the CRA makes them have to perform those audits because they appear to come with under the wire of placing on the market in the EU, and they are also supplying critical infrastructure.
Now we're actually talking more about open source projects that have become so used or so common and so well known and established that they are completely.
But it can happen to anybody, I don't know if you remember when Facebook had a big outage recently. Facebook, Facebook, it's a great story. Facebook updated their boundary routing, and suddenly nobody could reach Facebook because the boundary routing was in error. And they tried to get access to the server facility to go and roll back the change. And the door locks on the server facility used their single sign-on system. And they couldn't actually get into the building. And somebody had to go and cut a hole in the wall with an angle grinder so they could get in to go change the system. So Facebook could be critical infrastructure to some people. If it's, you know, if it's being used for single sign-on in an area that rises to the threshold. So you can't just say that something isn't going to be critical infrastructure. You've actually got to go and check whether, you know, did we decide to make all the door locks in this 50-person apartment block use a piece of software running on a Raspberry Pi? Well, if we did that, it's critical infrastructure, and I've suddenly got a set of liabilities that need auditing by a third party.
So that sounds like proper risk assessment is a core part of anything around this.
Yes.
And what does that mean? Like, if a business suddenly gets an idea that, oh, maybe I have some critical infrastructure that is involved here, the risk assessment, that's like asking what type of questions and then figuring out. Please, a very quick overview.
Like,
what does that mean?
Due diligence, like having a map of what can go wrong and what have you done to try to mitigate those situations. Like, really think about the error conditions based on your functions. It's basic stuff, but more people should do it.
Yeah, it's just like, if these types of errors happen, what are the consequences, basically?
Yeah.
Yeah, and just going through all of them.
It's quite typical for a authentication system to have this thinking that you shouldn't rely on the authentication system and needing that to be able to fix the authentication system.
Right.
So
that might be a type of question. So, so that means basically these laws are coming, and businesses have to do some serious introspection on what the risks are.
And we're ready for that.
Yeah, that's also business here.
Yes.
Bring it on. Yeah.
Bring your stuff. Yeah. You had a question there.
Yeah, there's another one.
No?
And this is bringing into another angle on this because of the world situation where Taiwanese companies has been said you can't provide phone infrastructure to Europe or to United States. You can't buy anything from China, even if they are using open source. And they kind of themselves are putting onto Android on their stuff, or in the phone carrier they put into open source inside a phone central. And 10, 12 years ago I was in China, 15 years ago, and I talked to them when they did 2G, and they didn't understand anything about software. But now this is a world thing. So my question is how this new regulation will then compute regarding the rest of the world, because basically you will let people out and in, who's going to get and who's not going to provide you with software.
I mean, let's face it. You know, well, actually, you're Danish, so you're an EU citizen.
Yes.
Most of us aren't actually in the EU, so we're actually already in a third country.
But we tend to say Norwegians are the best Europeans, because even though they're not in EU, they implement it better than we do.
You know, as you know, Britain has just opted in to be regulated without being consulted as well.
Yeah.
Welcome to the club.
Yes, great. Thank you so much.
So that's actually, it's quite interesting because this legislation we're talking about today is partially product. CRA is mainly product, but the rest would be more in the angle of nationally, what are you going to do to protect the infrastructure, or with the Digital Markets Act, how are you going to control what type of market you want or you don't want. We should talk a little bit about that as well. So the choice of software is a political decision, but what I heard there also was that it uses free and open source code to do it. So there wouldn't be anything in the legislation that prevents another manufacturer from taking their own version of that and then implementing it in whatever way they suit. In that sense, the CRA is quite ruthless because it's about manufacturer. It's up to you. So as much as we talked about the free and open source developers maybe being harassed or for that matter, when these companies want to get something out of them, they to me they should be humble and you know come with peace and money hopefully, and that way we'd be able to solve things more amicably than just trying to force ourselves into it. But I agree with Salve that the writing is perhaps a bit annoying in the CRA because it could lead to a situation where developers will not have a good time with manufacturers harassing them over the component that they specifically maintain. Again, a one-guy situation around the world too, for that matter.
Yeah.
But the answer to that was basically, it's a political decision with software choice / company choice, or preventing one country not doing something. But on the other hand, there are backdoors, for sure, as it usually is.
So before we open up for a conversation with participants in the room here, is there anything we should ask or expect or hope for the different open source participants or practitioners or communities to think? Like, what's a good approach to take for somebody who just wants to write some code and now sees this in the horizon? Should they be worried? Is there something they can start doing already now? Are there some coordination efforts that needs to start? What do you guys think?
Well, it depends on whether they're in the EU or not.
Or if they have users that are making something for someone in the EU?
Well, I'm less worried about that. The things that you can personally do, if you happen to be an EU citizen, that means you have an MEP. This bill is currently in review in Parliament, and those MEPs very much welcome guidance from citizens.
I have written to my MP about this. Yes, I recommend.
So if anyone here is in the lucky position of still having an MEP, then you should possibly.
But that's a little bit of a short deadline. But
that's a very short deadline. I'm very happy to catch people up on the state of play at the moment as well. In terms of the wider question, I think open source communities. I think we're going to get this to the point where the individual developer who is not placing software on the market in the European Union needs to worry particularly about the CRA. I think we'll get that sorted, honestly.
Though they're strictly not placing anything, they are just publishing.
Yeah, well, we have to work out how to get an understanding with the Commission and the Parliament so that the wording doesn't even appear to implicate them.
Right.
Now, assuming we do all that, the main consequence is going to be open source communities are going to have lots of people downstream expecting there to be a software bill of materials and expecting that software bill of materials to contain information that will give them the confidence to place a CE mark on their software. And for some communities, that will be quite welcome to actually have their users talk to them for the first time, maybe invest in their communities, maybe be willing to hire developers even. For other communities, that will be unwelcome because there was a great blog post that someone did a little while back where he said, "I am not your supplier." He said that he really wants you to understand that your role in using my software is no different from a rat digging in the bin outside my house looking for something tasty to eat. You know, I've written my software, I've put it out. I have no intention of being your supplier under any I don't want your money. All I did was I put it under the BSD license so that anyone could use it. And if you want to use it, you knock yourself out and use it. I am not going to give you an SBOM because I am not your supplier. And I think there's going to be quite a few people who see themselves in that position. But I think in the larger communities, I'm expecting in the Python community, I'm expecting in the Java community, I'm expecting probably in the Perl community, although you're wilder than others. I'm expecting to see a responsible a structure put in place to deal with downstream requesting upstream information on the cyber safety of components. But I think communities have to be ready for it because there are going to be a lot of people downstream who are suddenly going to take an interest in who is upstream, and you need to be ready to answer their questions is, I think, the biggest thing.
For the individual developer, it's about writing good software. It's about following the things you're already following. Like thinking about this as if it's going to ruin philosophy or the reasoning why you're doing behind it. That shouldn't happen. That's not the point here. But if it can be reasonably fixed, again, and morally speaking, especially if it relates to a lot of devices, it would be nice. But again, as I said earlier, humble and lots of money would be a better approach. But even then, if you can potentially, let's just say, save lives or at least save financial damage from you changing a little bit in your component or your dependent, that's good. Like I wish this legislation is not telling you to do that as such, but that would be ideal. Now, I would prefer that there was a remuneration mechanism and all this, but the problem is just the EU doesn't have this much power because of the EU treaty. So you're in a situation where the competence of each country prevent the EU from perhaps doing a way of redistributing money or something else that could help the individual developer in a few.
So in a sense, it's actually a little bit also up to the businesses to start caring about their own upstream dependencies. So, for example, is it sensible for a business to start looking at the different open source communities to hire someone? Is that meaningful? Like to have an actual representative in-house that can be a liaison towards some community that they have a heavy dependency on, for example? Or do we need to look at ways to do small funding? Like there are already grant systems in place many places, but that to me it sounds like if you want money, then you can ask for it, and that's almost like taking off your hat and going up to someone and say, "Do you have some money for some open source development, please?" And that sounds like a very off-putting power relationship. Like somebody who uses your software shouldn't come and demand really much. It's more about helping and sharing in the open source community.
Well, I'd hope that would be the result, but the rest would be obviously forking. So you end up in a situation where they might even hire or take part of the community away to make their own version of those dependencies. Or more maliciously than that, like for example, companies outside the EU providing these services and then sending this back to the manufacturers who then benefit from this. So there might be some not so nice things may happen exactly because of this and exactly with the reason, well, with the bad intention in the first place. So, but ideally yes. But again, as I said, EU is limited. Like I don't, as Simon put it, there are some people that really love free and open source software that have written this. So had they had the opportunity to make a mechanism or start a mechanism, I think they would have done so. But they're limited because it's the EU.
One perspective I'm personally worried about has to do with the amount of businesses now that will suddenly be aware that they have an open source dependency. I saw a number a while back that just for the CRA it was in the order of, I think it was 40,000 businesses just in Germany that would be affected by this. And if you just look at what kind of typical dependency tree they have inside one of those businesses, and you average it out through everyone, you can see that quite a substantial amount of these might suddenly be interested in one or more or a few open source communities that are of some size.
Possibly, but they would have to be placing software on the European market to actually take an interest. Because remember that using open source to build your products, particularly if they're software as a service products, doesn't actually imply you in any responsibilities under the CRA.
No.
So I'm not terribly concerned about that particular aspect. I think that for most users of open source software, they're using it for internal systems, and they almost certainly will not be in a position where they're placing on the market and have to put a CE mark on their work. I think that for the organizations that are placing software on the market, they're typically doing it as a service rather than as a distributed binary. And so I think the people who should be most concerned are the companies who are creating devices and embedding firmware, and the companies who are using open source software for their software products and not taking their responsibilities to the community seriously.
And this is all for the CRA.
This is all for just the CRA. And I don't think there are actually very many of them. I think that most companies have worked out that they need to have an OSPO, that they need to take a responsibility towards their critical upstreams. So I don't feel it's going to be a massive impact.
I'm also thinking about the NIS2 directive because that's comes in addition in my mind. So there's a critical infrastructure this bit there also, which has exactly the same situation where they have lots of the open source dependencies. So for me, I'm gracefully ignoring what you just said and saying that I want to be worried anyway.
Yeah, you can be worried.
Yeah, on behalf of everyone, of these people. But you mentioned an interesting term here, and that's an OSPO. Could you very quickly tell us what that is?
So it's an open source program office. It's when a company recognizes that there is a strong dependency on open source software in their business. When you have a dependency on open source software in your business, you have a number of behaviors that it's wise to adopt. One of them is to be in a good relationship with the upstream suppliers of your software. And so responsible businesses have an employee who has a relationship with the places the software is coming from. So if you're using a lot of Perl software in your business, you really should have somebody who's a member of the Perl community on your staff. And that person, rather than necessarily working in a particular subdivision of the company, might well work in a centralized office, reporting to the CTO or reporting to another C-level function that has responsibility for your compliance with open source software licenses, your relationships with your upstream communities, and now your compliance with the CRA, and with your public position with regard to open source. So it's typically the group that will run your company.com/open source page, right, where people go to find out whether you're a good citizen or whether you're pretending to be a good citizen or not. So an OSPO is now a very common thing in larger companies. It's becoming common in smaller companies as well. There is now a European Union OSPO. So the European Commission has got an open source program office that coordinates all of their activities with open source. And
what would be a sensible lower bar? Like how many employees in a business would you think is now? It's time to think about this. What criteria do you have to?
Well, so I used to run. I ran one of the first open source program offices in the industry back in 2004, and so there was me. I had someone on my staff who looked after our internal open source community, ran internal events. I had an attorney assigned to me out of the General Counsel's office who was responsible for our open source license compliance. I had somebody who was responsible for our outward-facing appearance regarding open source, which because the company in question was Sun Microsystems, we had a fairly rocky relationship initially. So I had at peak about 7 people. And that was in a company that was with a nearly 6-figure number of employees. Yeah, so it doesn't need to be a very big function.
Yeah, but
it will need to have it's less a number of people. It's more what the competences that need to be represented.
Right.
And you need to. It isn't open source is not a legal matter. It uses legal licenses as a tool, as a trick, in order to create some freedoms for the software to exist in. So you do need some legal understanding, but you mustn't let it be a division of the General Counsel's office, because if you do, your OSPO will turn into a dead letter that kills your company. But you need to have a legal competence, you need to have a marketing competence, you need to have an internal process compliance competence, and you need to have a reporting line into your C-level executives, because without that, what will happen is the things you need to fix in the company will typically be where you do something which is really bad, looks really bad to open source communities, and you need to have the reporting line that will let you go and let the CEO stop that thing from happening, even though you're not in the reporting chain of the company, of the bit of the company that is doing it. So those are the critical competencies. You need legal, you need marketing, you need internal process, and you need executive oversight.
Right. And what is the size of the company was what I meant to ask. Like, if you are a company of size 100 or 1,000, 10,000, roughly when should you or ought you to think about OSPOs?
You probably need an OSPO once you are what the European Union would describe as a medium business.
Okay.
Which is around about 250 employees.
Okay.
So that would probably be a member of staff who's got responsibility for open source. They'd be your open source officer, and they'd have a dotted line into someone in your, because at that size company, you'll probably have a legal counsel with outside counsel.
Right.
So they'll have a relationship with the general counsel, and they'll have a relationship with your marketing function. And they might have an assistant, so they'd be a two-person OSPO.
And it's also kind of dependent on to what extent you do in-house development.
Yes.
We're using open source software, and if you don't, then it doesn't.
And some of the larger companies are now getting rid of their OSPOs again. They've been through the cycle, they've had the OSPO, and they're now building the function into the groups where it is relevant, which I quite like that as an idea. You know, there's that old joke that if a company has a quality department, that means it's the only place where there's any quality. And similarly, you might feel the same about an OSPO. So I quite like the idea of it being folded back into the company once it's mature.
We're nearing our end. It's still a little bit while.
There are questions.
Yes, but before we go to our audience here, are there any final thoughts and points that are unsaid that we would like to make sure are being said?
Should we talk about the Digital Markets Act, or should we shelve that?
I'd shelve that. So the Digital Markets Act, so I don't care about the Digital
No.
Markets Act because it doesn't affect open source.
Indeed.
So other people care about it, but I don't care about it. But the Digital Markets Act is going to be a great thing because it is going to unlock the walled gardens of app stores, and it is going to make instant messaging interoperable across vendors by law. And it's going to do many other wonderful things that unfortunately no one actually knows how to do. And so the workshops in Brussels have been fascinating about it. But it doesn't have an open source aspect, so honestly, I don't care, Kaspar.
Only part that would have perhaps an open source aspect would be that we can force the platforms to, speaking of having good relationship with the open source community, have that, because else they can't fulfill the act. But
Yes.
other than that,
At the moment, they're not being terribly nice about that, I've discovered.
No.
The one thing I would say is the quote I gave you didn't involve rats.
Yes, okay.
He said, "I'm not your supplier, so all your supply chain ideas, you're not buying from a supplier. You are a raccoon digging through dumpsters for free code," he said,
Much better.
which is much better.
Much nice.
But how will this be audited and enforced?
which one of them?
Yes.
CE marking, basically.
Oh, so CE marking in the EU has two levels essentially in most product legislation, and in EU we have notified bodies, which is the ones that test. But as mentioned, a lot of products are self-certified. So until it's an assumption that they will conform. Yeah, but it does work a lot of the time. And again, the EU is the leading place in the world for this for some reason. But basically, with this, you have notified bodies. And the notified bodies can test and will test. And notified bodies are interesting because in the EU we allow private notified bodies. You'd think it's all public. No, most of them are private, both in medical devices, cars, in this case too most likely. And then the next level will be the authority. So the authority will be on top and will do sometimes sweeps, auditing, whatever. They're very free. They can do quite a lot of different things. So it's up to each country's authority what will happen here. But then the next level of auditing would be companies are obviously interested in knowing this before it happens. So they want to do audits, third-party audits themselves before that, which is where we can come in and do work. So the auditing would hopefully be the technical aspects of penetration testing and all the other standard security things in terms of ex ante or ex post, as in before the adversarial attacks, after the adversarial attacks.
Should open source communities do auditing of their users?
Not their users. So that's that depends. Some free or open source software communities will be included by the CRA, some clearly won't. So that even from the current text, there will still be some lines. But as we talked about here, it can be hard to decipher. And honestly, I wish we had a couple of good academic papers that could agree on just the academics' view on this. We don't. So it's very annoying. Yeah. But yeah, if you're in a certain size, then I don't see why not. Because from a security perspective, you'd want these things to be as good as possible. And on the other hand, you want them to be as good as possible to deal with the outcome when it fails. So in some ways, yes, of course, because in the end, we want the best security possible for everyone else's sake and ourselves.
Yeah. So the other thing that's going to happen is the way that you can demonstrate compliance with EU regulations is by complying with standards with European standards.
Right.
Now, there are no European standards in this area at the moment, and so the CRA creates the possibility that the European Union will request standards for cybersecurity.
So the
And-
ISO will come in and...
Well, it won't be. It's actually even worse than that. It won't be ISO that comes in. It will either be Senelec or it will be ETSI, because they are the two European standards organizations. And so there is the prospect of ETSI producing a standard for cybersecurity, which I think would be gruesome in the extreme.
And
so,
we'll have to pay a larger amount just to read the text, and that's stuff going on here.
well, ETSI doesn't charge for their standards, but
It will happen in
they have the
stores.
disadvantage that it's extremely difficult for open source organizations to be a member. So OSI is a member of ETSI at the moment, but I think it's very unlikely that any other community is going to join. And so the standard will be written by organizations that don't really like open source very much. And it's likely that cybersecurity rate standards will therefore not be terribly compatible with the way that open source projects see the world. So that is actually one of my big... So this session started out asking, is EU regulation going to kill open source? And the most likely vector by which that will happen is by cybersecurity standards being written by an organization that wants to kill open source. And that organization is ETSI.
Right.
And then there's a final comment. The good part about EU law is we can talk about purposes and spirit of the law. They really matter in EU law. And such standards that kill critical, essentially, parts of the whole society or organism that is this community will be against the spirit of this kind of legislation. So if that happens, other actions must be taken to prevent it killing open source in this situation. So that's the good part about EU law, is at least, it cares about you can't go against the purpose of the legislation, the spirit of legislation, which is here more resilience. You won't create more resilience by ruining the community that creates the resilience in the first place, or 60% of it.
So it's not quite yet time to run into a corner and start crying.
You can always sit and cry in a corner.
You've got a couple of years before that.
Okay, that's good. Let's open the floor for some questions. I think we have a few minutes for that.
Maddie again, and I'm wondering from a practical standpoint, if we look at EU enforcement for, say, the GDPR, they're not starting by going to finding individual developers doing small-scale business to do this. So I don't think anybody's going to be scrubbing GitHub for bits of open source that are being developed that don't have a CE mark in order to issue fines. But I also think that the main remedy they have is fines and monetary damages. And isn't a practical solution just for some of the open source communities to incorporate into nonprofits with lack of revenue so that there's nothing to go after?
So many of the open source communities are already in that position.
It's the larger ones.
Yes.
Yeah. The problem is the size range is enormous.
Possibly. It all depends on how the PLD ends up apportioning liability. If all of the liability involved is as a percentage of the sale price, we're all good. If it is proportional to revenues, it could actually be pretty serious for a small non-profit, because it could result in because all of their revenues are to do with paying staff to do administrative functions typically, and they could well find themselves in a position where they're wiped out by one claim. So there is going to be a bit of a concern in that area, I think, and I think that's why. We wrote a letter last week. 12 open source charities wrote a letter last week to the European Commission asking them, pretty please, would they like to ask us a few questions about this legislation before they promulgate it. We'll see whether anybody replies. I have a hunch. What do you think?
I really hope so. Because
I really hope they reply.
Yeah.
So if you want to go find that, it's been doing the rounds on the news. It's 12 open source organizations write to the European Commission and it says it's about the CRA expressly, but it's deeper than that. It's about saying, please, will you not legislate about open source without talking to open source charities? Because the only way that the European Union knows how to consult at the moment is with civil society organizations, aka consumer groups, or with corporations. And open source isn't developed by either. Open source is developed by what many people call the fourth sector. It is by ordinary citizens in various relationships to the code and to other organizations. and they're typically not represented by a trade union or by a consumer group or by a company. And the European Commission made absolutely no attempt to communicate with the open source fourth sector for any of this legislation. They actually went out of their way to communicate with small and medium enterprises. They sought them out even when they failed to respond to the inquiries, but they made absolutely no attempt to talk to the Open Source Initiative, to the Free Software Foundation Europe, to Open Forum Europe, to Appel, to any of the fairly well-known European organizations that represent open source developer interests. And so we've appealed to them to please change that behavior and actually come talk to us if they're going to legislate about something which is in our interest area. If they do come talk to us, we will help them with this particular topic, because there's no point. I take your point particularly about following the money and taking legal action against the place where the money is. The CRA doesn't do that. The CRA implicates people who have no money, and the reason it does that is it incorrectly assumes that that there is an identity between the product on the market and the people who developed it. They must, in proprietary software, the company that develops the software and the software are pretty much an identity. And so if you want to regulate the software, you can deal with the people who developed it. But in open source, there's no necessary connection between the software, the company placing on the market, and the people who develop the software. And the CRA implicitly places a liability on the people developing the software.
There's a funny thing there. There's quite a bit of projects out there that actually do not have any custodian, or
Yes.
They are abandoned projects that are in use in businesses out there. And that, how would you do that? Like, does the liability or the whatever go one step up to the general community or the meta community, or do we just have to fork stuff?
So that I mentioned earlier, but GitHub is actually developing tools to estimate or figure out, whether or not there will be issue with such repositories or dependencies or artifacts already. It connects quite well with this, but yeah, basically you're running into a situation where that legacy, well, it's not legacy code, very important code.
Yeah, no, it's in use and earning money.
Yeah, can end up causing security issues down the line, and then there might be no actual fix other than forking at all.
We're very hopeful that we'll be able to, through the amendment process in the Parliament, lead to individuals not receiving a liability for code simply because it's been placed on the market by another party. Yeah. And if we can reach that position, I'm not too worried. Yeah. I think that is actually where we're going to get to.
We are in the situation where this product legislation, each state's powers need to have these powers. So it's written in this way, does not mean it will be done in the most extreme way possible. But I agree that if you read the sweeps part, for example, of the CRA, it's quite extreme. Yep. And that's the usual bit with product legislation. They get the powers, but they won't necessarily use them. And compared to GDPR, which wasn't product legislation, GDPR is special. It's in another category entirely. From other product legislation, we know that they are quite lenient and even often very flexible when it comes to not hunting down for single developers.
It sounds like some kind of a sword of Damocles just hanging over your head. And you don't know if it's going to drop or not.
This is the other problem, is that open source developers typically don't have access to counsel. Yeah. And open source developers typically have very literal minds, and they believe that licenses compile. And as a consequence, if they perceive a legal risk, they believe that it definitely applies to them and will harm them. And that is the biggest threat to open source, I think, is people seeing the CRA, seeing the degree of uncertainty around it, and deciding that is scary enough to make them withdraw. Yeah. I think that is actually going to be the biggest impact that we have.
Just I don't want to have anything.
I don't want to have anything to do with this. This sounds very scary. I'm not going to do my SSL library anymore.
Then we'll have European open source, and we'll have the global open source, maybe a Chinese open source over there. Who knows? Any more questions? We have one more question on there.
And I will bring you back to democracy and EU Parliament.
Thank you.
And the reason for that, this is EU Parliament. It seems to me that it's going to end up in the EU Parliament. Some people there, 600, 700, going to vote, isn't it? So last time this happened, when it was really crucial regarding software, was in the beginning of the 2000 regarding software patents.
2005.
Exactly.
Been there, got the T-shirt.
And I remember back then I was talking to EU bureaucrats because we were invited by UD, which is the foreign agency or the foreign ministry in Norway, as a representative for Norway presenting free and open source software for the bureaucrats. And we really warned them about software patents in that meeting. And the EU bureaucrats was totally certain that this legislation will be passed through with just a rubber stamp. And we had lost, and they told us so. And strangely, they only got 14 votes out of almost 70.
It was even better than that, actually. What happened was on the day of the vote, the parties decided to withdraw the bill.
Exactly.
And the reason that happened, if you're interested, was because the Software Patent Directive did not create protections for interoperability. And because there were no protections for interoperability which had been included in the Copyright Directive, the Conservative group within the Parliament decided the bill was not ready for decision and decided to withdraw it on the day of the vote. And that happened as a result of very selective, very targeted lobbying, if you're interested.
And here it comes, the question. Is it because of this kind of bureaucratic certainty, and they only ask people that are in line with their benefit of having an easy day on their job, talking only to organizations that are put there to talk to them? We have the same in Norway. They don't listen to the general public. We have the same in Ukraine, supporting Ukraine with foreign aid. It's a civil organization who does 85% of that. And here it comes. Then they disregard the help people actually need, that are the ones that are crucially those who are hurt about this legislation. Is it any possible to persuade some heads about here in the parliament?
Well, I wouldn't want to talk about that. So there is a group of people from the open source community who are now meeting every Tuesday to work out what to do about the CRA, and we've been meeting for about 2 months, and we have submitted many amendments to, first of all, to the Commission and now to the Parliament, and we have discussions with some of the groups involved in the Parliament. We're not completely confident at the moment that things are going to go in the right direction. To pull off the pressing the red button tactic, we haven't yet found a cause that would make someone press the red button on this legislation. Now, with the Software Patent Directive, I was aware that it didn't have an interoperability provision for about 9 months before it came to the vote. And I was visiting people in the Commission to help them understand the problem. Okay, for this bill, we've not identified any issue which is big enough to override the MEP's populist concern with consumer protection. And I feel it is very unlikely that anyone is going to decide to press the red button on the wall. Could still happen, and we could still find the reason to do that very late in the day. Having said that, I think it would be quite bad to do that, because I actually quite want a good Cyber Resilience Act. I think that it's very important for consumer protection to make sure that people who sell devices that can provide access to your home, what we're talking here is about protecting consumers from digital home invasions. And I think that we want the legislation that makes it a legal requirement for people to take care of you and not let people invade your home digitally. I just don't want it to kill open source in the process. And I'm very hopeful that there are sufficient people involved in the process that understand the collateral damage that could be caused by extending liability down the supply chain, treating the supply chain as if it was a proprietary company and letting the liability flow down. That would be a terrible mistake, and people understand that now, I think. There would be a terrible problem if they fail to understand that platforms that distribute software are not manufacturers. because at the moment in the CRA there is an implication that, for example, SourceForge or GitHub are manufacturers of the software that they convey. And it would be a very bad mistake indeed for the CRA to do that. So there is language being inserted that, hopefully being inserted, that fixes those problems. If the Parliament fixes those issues, and if the changes I see happening with the Product Liability Directive reduce the negative consequences for those who fail to meet their duties in a way that is not negligent, and if the supporting legislation in the AI Act and the Digital Market Act and the what else is there?
Well, there's also the NIS2 directive.
There's NIS2. Well, but NIS2 is in the process of being.
Oh yeah, that already is.
Yeah, but it was so NIS2 went onto the books in Parliament last year.
Yeah, September.
In fact, in 2021, I think it went on.
Oh yeah, the earlier version. Yeah.
So NIS2 is too late, and the place where we can have an effect there is in each country by country, making sure it doesn't do too much harm.
About that, by the way, now that some of those laws have to be implemented locally, I'm expecting there might be some public hearings or something in that effect. Who knows? I'm hoping. Is there anything, those of us who care about these topics locally in our national legislations that we should think about when we start interacting the local implementations? That would help to make at least to roll off the worst of bad effects.
Well, so when it comes to directives, sadly, I don't know how do directives end up being implemented in the EEA.
So it as I said earlier, hinted it. Norway is the best lad in class. You know, like you do the best usually in terms of ideally and loyally implementing all EU legislation proper. Like when Denmark, Sweden we look towards Norway in terms of how to do it right, because you do it to a T.
Yeah, Norway has influence. That's
unlike
clear.
Switzerland, where they always try their best to not do whatever and go to court over it endlessly. They're so annoying. So basically it's one-to-one the same, and it's in the same way of people wanting to sell on the market in a CRA sense. Yes, you're from Brazil. Oh, you want to sell that here? Good. Then essentially you have to obey EU law in that context. So that's the Brussels effect. It will hit you whether you want to or not. But in a free and open source context, from developer side, you know, on a worldwide basis, then we want to acknowledge and prevent. But again, we can't right now in the wording, but maybe interpretation-wise, if we don't get into the wording, we can prevent it injuring the community.
Are there specific questions we should ask?
Right. Well, so I couldn't tell you now.
Okay.
But what I would suggest is that we do have a reasonable group of people who have been getting deep into all the legislation, and when the time comes and you see the Product Liability Directive update coming into Oslo to be implemented, come and ask. So the group that's been reviewing the CRA all the way through, all the way along the process, will have very strong opinions about what needs watering down and what needs strengthening and what needs modifying. And there will be a group of people who will be able to advise you. So come and ask me, come and ask the folks at Open Forum Europe or at Appel, which is the European Open Source and Free Software Group. Free Software Foundation Europe also has a very effective policy group.
Published much on this, like as guidelines or anything like?
Not really. No.
Okay.
Mostly, we've been frantically trying to keep up with the stream of legislation.
Right.
The thing about publishing things is you have to be much more confident about the truth about what you said when you publish it than when you're distributing notes amongst all the people who are frantically trying to keep up with everything. So we have lots of notes, but nothing that I would feel confident putting on a website without legal review. And as I don't have a lawyer, it won't be happening.
Yeah. Right. Any more questions? I see a hand up back there.
Please hold.
Holding for microphone. So Tom Fredrik Blending, I'm a board member of ISOC and the executive director of Electronic Frontier Norway. So I'm not going to pretend this to even be a question because it's more of a comment. So I know for a fact. The EU very much sees themselves as a lawgiver, also to the EEA, even though we don't have MEPs from Norway. So there are open consultations that we can participate in. I've read Kaspar's consultation on CSR, but there's also people from Norway, like Lee Bygrave, for instance, from the Institute of Law here in Oslo, who are actively participating. I've been myself, I've been called as an expert before the EU Parliament. It very much depends on the type of legislation. Sometimes there's actually a lack of experts, so they are very much in need. They want to have you contributing. Other times it's very, very political, and they're gonna try to shut you out. So it depends. But what I would like to say is there are processes. There are opportunities to influence the EU, even if you're from Norway, and we should start to actually take the EU law process seriously, because since we implemented the EEA, we implemented about 15,000 acts from the EU as part of Norwegian law. Currently, we are at about 75% of all Norwegian law comes from the EU. So being vigilant about these things happening, there are opportunities and we should use them. And sorry about the lack of question.
No, thank you for your contribution.
Should open source communities start caring about EU law?
Totally.
Totally. But
the EU has noticed that open source exists. Be very afraid.
So, but that means hiring some legal in the
No,
foundation,
you just join FSF Europe and OSI.
Right.
If you're an open source organization, you can join OSI. It's free of charge. You become an OSI affiliate, and OSI will represent you or coordinate with you, depending on whether you want to be actively involved or intellectually involved.
Yeah.
Free Software Foundation Europe will do a very similar thing for you. If you want to spend more money, Open Forum Europe will let you become a member, but they take a fee. Perl, you could become a member at Perl. They've been taking an interest as well. So I think open source communities should definitely take an interest in EU affairs, because
even if they're US based and said, oh no, those Europeans, they are they're just making a mess.
One of the mistakes the European Union makes is they believe that software can have national boundaries applied across it, and it would be foolish to believe the same. Yeah. Open source software is created by global citizens who can be anywhere, and just as everybody benefits from the global nature of open source, so open source has to understand that it can be affected by global affairs. You can decide that you are going to be, working from your mother's basement in Nebraska, as is the XKCD meme. But even there, you will probably be wanting to design your software so that it complies with the law as it's emerging in various countries. And we mustn't forget that China has worked out that regulation is an effective barrier to trade as well, and is consequently engaging in WIPO-approved patent and regulatory activities that mean that you should pay attention to what China is doing, because they can also affect the way that the architecture of your... If the architecture of your project is one library, you probably don't have to care. If you're designing Perl and CPAN, you should probably be paying attention to where the boundaries are.
Are there any good news sources on these topics, by the way, that you would recommend? Like an RSS feed.
Yeah, so the good part about the cybersecurity and computer science part angle of this is that most of the papers are open source, so you could read them regardless of your affiliation or work. But don't try to read the law papers. They're often behind paywalls. And on the other hand, this is the EU, so anything you want to read from them, transparent and easy to access, luckily.
So you can subscribe to alerts from the European Union on these topics, and you'll find you get quite a lot of them. Everything is translated into every European language. So you
Norwegian
can,
is
so you can,
Danish.
so you'll be able to get it in Danish or
Yeah.
Swedish. It can be a little bit inscrutable, but it's actually remarkably readable once you've got used to it.
Yeah.
As a news source, there is a news channel called Euractiv, and Euractiv has excellent coverage of EU technology law issues, and it's actually worth reading their materials. I would follow the policy hashtag on Mastodon, because that's what everyone tags all their policy-related things with. If you follow #open source and #policy on Mastodon, you'll get everything that I write about it, for example.
That's awesome.
So I'd be following those things. But it's, read the laws. They're actually written. They're all written in English for the person with English as a second language.
No more legalese?
There is legalese in there, because just every topic has technical terminology. But once you become familiar with the structure, so as Kaspar was saying earlier, they all come with a set of explanation at the top, which tends to be called recitals. They all come with a set of things that have legal effect, called articles, and they all come with a set of variable parts or longer reading that are called annexes. And once you're used to that structure, you can find out pretty much what the law says just by reading the recitals. You typically don't need to read the articles, because the articles are typically they're very precise. They're quite complex structures, whereas the recitals say in very clear terms what this bill is supposed to do. And so you can just read the recitals and pretty quickly understand what the law does.
Right. Brilliant. I think we've run out of time, and it's awesome to end on a note that is actionable and can help us get better informed. And I would say thank you to the three of you that came here and informed us on such short notice. Thank you to everybody who watched the stream or came here to join us with questions and an open mind about what's going on. We're going to say thank you to everybody now and say this was all. And if I put on my ISOC hat again, Internet Society is a membership organization that cares about policy stuff around the internet in Norway. That's the Norwegian chapter that does that. But we're also a global organization that cares about how the internet is used, and it continues to be a force for good around the globe. So I urge you to join. If you are in Norway, we also have a policy channel where we discuss issues like these now and then, and coordinate if there's some public consultations, for example, that we might reply to. In any case, I hope to see some of you or all of you at meetings in the future. And we're a tiny community and a tiny country, and those of us who are here, we care about policy issues, I think, and I hope you came here because of that. So please know that there are more like you, and we're trying to gather each other so we can make this more a viable community that tries to improve the situation, not only for ourselves in Norway, but also have public conversations for things that are relevant for the Swedes and the Danish that listen to Norwegians, apparently, and anybody else. Thank you for coming. I urge you to join our organization, and that's about it. A hand for our panel, please.
Thank you.